Welcome to Football Insiders. Jason Andera, Midco Sports, Michael McCleary, Argus Leader Media, and we're about halfway through the season for some of these small schools, and we'll be at halfway through the season for a lot of these big schools so far this year. Do you feel like we have a little more understanding than a couple weeks ago of what's going on in South Dakota high school football?
No.
Exactly. We keep unraveling, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot more understanding for me, from my perspective coming in. But there's still a lot that I guess we don't know at this point of the season. I mean, there's still a bunch of teams that are kind of fighting for position in those 2, 3, 4 spots of the rankings. I mean, we sort of have a lot of number ones carved out in each class, but there are some that's kind of wide open still. So.
Well, let's go back and see what we learned from President's Bowl weekend, the first time we've ever had 4 games for the President's Bowl over 2 days. And we'll start with the first game of that day. Taylon Ashley absolutely goes off for 7 touchdowns. Rapid City Stevens fights their way back into the game, but they didn't have enough to catch up with what Jefferson set up ahead of them. Yeah,
I got to say, one of the more impressive players I saw this weekend was Jed Jensen. Stevens' quarterback. He's a legitimately really talented player on that Stevens team. The defense isn't totally strong with them. There were times where Jefferson just almost seemed like it was just too easy for them to score. Ashley is a game changer. Griffin Wilde is a game changer. But that Jefferson team hasn't totally been right there as an offensive team. I mean, that was probably their best offensive game of the season by far. So the defense isn't totally strong, but Jed Jensen is a player that's going to take Stevens as far as they go. He's a really good player, and if they were going to get back into that game, it was going to be because of Jed Jensen and showing some of the stuff that he showed in the beginning of the game. First play of the game, scoring a touchdown.
Yeah, to Alex Turkmonen, who's gone over 180 yards each of the last 2 weeks, and he's looked like one of the most outstanding receivers in 11 AAA as well. It's interesting because Stevens, they played such good defense against Brandon Valley the first week. They played such good defense for at least half a game against Roosevelt before they kind of started seeing some holes in that defense, and then we saw some more holes in that defense when Ashley starts running all over everybody. So they did better in the second half containing him to not run at least, but he still threw for 370 yards, and 2 of his receivers were over 100. So Ashley can throw when he needs to as well.
Yeah, he had over 400 yards from scrimmage, and I think he ran for 2 touchdowns and threw for 5. Was it?
It was 3 and 4, but
3 and 4. Okay,
way,
yeah. I mean,
crazy.
But there was one play where he had spent time lined up on the outside for like 5 plays in a row, where he was just sort of a decoy, lining up wide. Then he kind of came back under center, just almost nonchalantly, just kind of rolled out and ran for a touchdown. I mean, it was. Ashley could be coming into his own, and potentially that's the reason for maybe not the best performance from the Stevens defense, but it just seemed too easy for Jefferson after a while. They were clearly the better team in this matchup, and kind of opened some eyes that maybe Jefferson isn't that young group of players that came together for their first win. Maybe they're a legitimate contender this year.
I know, and I think we usually don't spend this much time on one team, but I'll tell you what, the offensive line for Jefferson's been the biggest surprise for me of any unit that I've seen so far this year. They have really, and it's not just because of those skill players, they have really met their match and handled a lot of good D-lines this year so far.
Absolutely.
So I think that's something to watch going forward, is seeing how this Jefferson line continues to, they've played really well. Lincoln hung with Harrisburg last Friday night. It was a 1-score game down to the end. Harrisburg made a few mistakes. Their defense has now had 3 underwhelming performances in a row. I mean, they did well enough against Pierre. They did give up a couple of scores early. They did well enough against O'Gorman after giving up a couple of scores early. Lincoln got to them throughout the game. Is that the weak link here for Harrisburg that we're talking about maybe in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way that you have to beat them. You got to score because they're going to put up numbers on offense. Gavin Ross is one of the best running backs in the state. Obviously, Jacob Knuth is the best quarterback in the state. So they got options in the passing and the rushing game that they're going to put points on the board. So you got to score. Gabe Gutierrez was really good for Lincoln. He's a fantastic two-way player too. He played really great as a linebacker as well. He seems to be like sort of the spiritual leader of that team. I saw him off on the sideline after they responded to a Harrisburg touchdown, and he gets really, really hyped up on the sideline.
I was talking to Jared Fredenberg before the season started, and he said, watch out, this Gabe Gutierrez, he might be like the next big-time player that we have at Lincoln. And I hadn't heard of him before, but I watched him this year, and he's been very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't. I heard about him first at Media Day from, people were talking about him as a linebacker, but, he was sort of the most consistent offensive option they had the other day.
And they needed big yards. They would go to Gabe.
Exactly. So, he's a really, really good player. And obviously, Lincoln is a solid team across the board. But the thing that was most impressive about Lincoln is they threw everything they had at Harrisburg. And Harrisburg seemed a little frazzled. They ended up winning that game, and head coach Brandon White said after the game, he was not happy, but, they did find a way to win, and that does sort of underscore how good Harrisburg is, that even in their worst game, they still win by a touchdown. Yep. But, Lincoln really, really impressed with how much they threw at them and, how high the energy was kept throughout the game, even as they went down at parts of the game by 2 touchdowns, a touchdown. They just kept it close, and they kept battling back, and they had a chance to tie it with about a minute left.
They had a couple chances in the fourth quarter to get close, and they just couldn't quite, edge that gap. But Lincoln looks like they're a team that is not afraid to play anybody right now, and Harrisburg looks like a team that's, even when they're not at their best, they're still the best team in the class. Let's move on to Saturday's games, where Washington got a quality win over O'Gorman. They really stifled O'Gorman offensively. I was impressed defensively by Washington, and then what they got from Elijah Tanai running the football after Blessing Tanai was hurt. That was the best running performance I've seen from Washington this year.
Yeah, and the playmakers on Washington's defense immediately stick out. But, I'm not ready to necessarily call them the best defense in the class, but that was the best defensive performance that I've seen personally. I saw earlier in the game, the Washington defense was pretty much dominating the entire time, which is very surprising with the playmakers that O'Gorman has. Right. Bennett Dannenberg was not his best. Manny Struck pretty much was, every single time he touched the ball, he was just absolutely clobbered.
He got a couple big hits in that game.
Yeah, and David Alpers just wasn't really a part of the offense that much, which is very surprising, just how big of a target he is. But Washington's defense dominated, but early in the game, it was really sort of, Washington kept it within striking distance, where they only scored 14. I think it was 10-0 for a while. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They were only up by 2 scores, and it was 10-0 for a while. And Elijah Tanai fumbled the ball, which gave O'Gorman a chance to bring it within 1 score. And he got really upset about that. And I saw center Aiden Brink off on the sideline talking him up. And after that, he went up and scored 2 touchdowns. Yeah. So that was a really, really impressive performance for him. Obviously, to come back after the fumble and score 2 touchdowns in the final 8:30. But this Washington team, they're not going to be the team that goes for the big play. They're not going to be the team that puts 40 points on the board, even though they scored 60 last week.
Yeah, but that's.
But that defense is going to keep them in the game. So as long as they keep on moving the ball, and as long as they keep possession and just keep on getting those short yard gains and then get into the end zone, they're going to be a problem. They're going to be a really, really good team going forward.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about this week's games here in just a moment. I think that's a really interesting one with Harrisburg to see where they measure up. But let's finish up the President's Bowl quick. Brandon Valley was able to run the ball against Roosevelt. Again, a close game. Roosevelt's been in a lot of close games this year. Every game has been fairly close for them, but they've been on the losing side each time. But I was really impressed with the way the Lynx were able to run the ball on them.
Yeah, I got a feel for Roosevelt a little bit here. This is probably the third heartbreaking loss they've had in a row, where they were sort of in control of this game up until the fourth quarter, but then that late touchdown from Brandon Valley, that was it. Roosevelt just didn't have enough, and that's sort of been the story of their season. They just didn't have that one last punch at the end, and it's. I would not doubt that Kim Nelson is extremely disappointed looking at an 0-3 team at this point of the year.
You know what? It is early. I still think that Roosevelt belongs in the conversation of those teams that could get something done, maybe a first-round win, maybe even go on a roll. We'll see. But Brandon Valley, they had that one big offensive explosion against Jefferson. They did that with some kick return plays, some good field position plays. But really, those other 2 weeks against Stevens and now against Roosevelt, they put up, 2 touchdowns in each of those games. They are not the explosive team we remember from last year. I think this Brandon Valley team needs to find a few sparks offensively when they have games like this where they can just rely on some guys. But, hey, they still got a 2-score win against Roosevelt.
Yeah, and they're good enough to win games on defense. Their defense has proven that, they're going to get the stops when they need to, and they, can allow the other team to score less than they do. I mean, obviously, at this point of the season, they do enough to win.
Right.
But when it comes later into the year, when you're playing those teams like Harrisburg that are going to put up those points, that's something that you really need, just otherworldly performances from their offensive playmakers, just to, edge them out.
We'll see how it turns out. Let's look to the schedule this week for 11 AAA. You've got number 1 Harrisburg at home against Washington. You've got number 2 Brandon Valley on the road against O'Gorman. Then after that, Jefferson is the number 3 team. They go to Yankton, so they're going to be playing an 11 AA team on the road. That's going to be a bit of a challenge. And then some other interesting ones. Stevens at Lincoln, and then Roosevelt takes on Central on Saturday. Which of those games interests you the most? What has the best storyline for potential intrigue?
I always think it's really interesting when a new team that is sort of up there takes on Harrisburg. And Washington has been trending upward since their Week 1 loss to Jefferson. I mean, they did not look good offensively Week 1.
Especially the first half.
For sure.
They kind of started to figure out how to run the ball the second half. But they were stymied that first half.
Yeah, and granted, I mean, Jefferson has been great offensively since then. So the Washington defense is legit. So, if there's ever going to be a defense that takes on that Harrisburg offense, I think it might be Washington. I mean, it does hinge on the health of Kendis Ledbetter, who, went down with a little bit of a hyperextended knee. Head coach Ryan Evans said that he expects him to be fine, but, fine doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to play this week.
Yeah, it doesn't mean 100%.
Exactly. So, but they got playmakers all over that defense. So, I expect them to cause Harrisburg some problems in a similar way that Lincoln did. They said it, as long as they get the offense that they need, potentially this is something that they squeak out. And, I see this trending in a similar direction as last week's Lincoln-Harrisburg game went, where Harrisburg probably edges out in the end, but it's going to be close, and Washington's going to have a few chances.
I think this Brandon Valley O'Gorman game is going to be fun. Last week, both teams struggled offensively. I think this might be another low-scoring game this week. Brandon Valley needs to find some playmakers. It's going to be O'Gorman's homecoming game. It's a little earlier in the day. They're at the MAC. This is going to be a big challenge for both teams. O'Gorman, they really want to snap back after losing to Harrisburg and then getting shut out by Washington last week. They're going to need some big plays to restore the roar over there at the MAC. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun. And then Stevens-Lincoln, look for big plays, I think, in this game. I mean, Stevens has made a living off of big plays these last couple weeks with Jed Jensen, who you mentioned, making a lot of those big plays. But really, Lincoln is the same way. They thrive off of trying to make big plays in the offensive game. So I think this will be a lot of fun. Pretty evenly matched game for me between Stevens and Lincoln. And the way the seeding is going to work out, I think it's going to be very important to get a top 4 seed. And if Lincoln and Stevens, either those two teams want to get a top 4 seed, this is a game they have to win.
For sure.
All right, let's move on to 11 AA. How good is Aberdeen Central? I mean, this is a team that's been, getting some attention at the top of the polls. Everybody's still kind of on board with T as the number one team, but what are your impressions of the Golden Eagles? Do you think that they are close to being the top team in 11AA?
Yeah, because, as good as T's been, I almost feel like they're on a bit of an unstable foundation where people are just kind of waiting for them to lose to knock them down in the poll. Yeah. Early on in the season, nobody wanted to put T at the top, but then they just kept on winning. So Aberdeen Central with, it almost feels like the teams are moving in opposite directions, which is probably unfair because T's been so good. And there's a chance that T can prove everybody wrong in that aspect by just keep on winning. But, Aberdeen Central, I feel like it's almost like a pleasant surprise with them where, they weren't expected to be in that top 5. And now they're, they keep on going up and up and up. And everybody's starting to realize that quarterback that they have is really good.
Yeah, Sam Rolfe's obviously the story in Aberdeen Central. He's run for 204 yards and 5 touchdowns. He's thrown for 621 yards and 8 touchdowns so far this year. A true dual threat quarterback. And going back to the beginning of the year, I remember talking to a lot of AA coaches, and they're like, I don't know what to expect from Aberdeen Central. This is the team we know the least about. They're coming into our class. We know they have Sam Rolfes. But what we found out, and I talked to Scott Svensson, head coach at Aberdeen Central, and he said our defense has been remarkably consistent this year, and he said that's the key to the success that we've had early on because we knew we had Rolfes. Jacob Merksbauer has been awesome. He's got 4 touchdowns receiving for the 8 that Rolfes has thrown this year, so he's been the main target there. I think this Aberdeen Central team could be one of the teams to watch. They've got an interesting matchup against Brookings, who's coming off of a win against Watertown last week. And after Brookings lost the very first week against T, I think they got dismissed in the polls a little bit. And this is a chance for Brookings to make a statement against Aberdeen Central. That could be a lot of fun. But as far as this week's games, so we've got Aberdeen Brookings, Watertown at Huron, T against Mitchell, and Pierre Douglas. So that Aberdeen Brookings game, the only top 5 matchup we have. But T has a road game in Mitchell that they're going to have to play well to solidify that number 1 spot. And Pierre shouldn't have any problem with Douglas and Watertown. The way Huron's played so far, you'd think Watertown has the leg up on that one as well. Any other thoughts on 11AA before we move?
Well, I'm really interested in T and just moving forward. I mean, I feel like Pierre was that team for me over the last couple weeks where, they had that just, pretty terrible matchup against Harrisburg in week 1. And then they've really only been trending up since then. But I think it'd be interesting. Is T ever going to lose? I mean, they're...
I didn't look at their schedule very closely. I should look at it quickly because...
Just the past couple weeks, ever since their week 1 win, I mean, they've all been very winnable games. And they've, to their credit, they've, won those games. But, if they never run into any problems in their schedule, I mean, it might be tough for Pierre, who potentially is better than a T team, that it might be tough for them to catch them in the polls.
It'll be interesting to see. So T is at home against Watertown next week after this Mitchell battle. Then they've got Douglas out in Box Elder. And then they come back home for Aberdeen Central on October 8th. So I think that's their best test the rest of the year. And then Spearfish and then West Central, a class below. But I'll tell you what, West Central is a team that could give them some problems as well. So to answer your question, are they going to lose? They don't have Pierre on the schedule, but they are going to have to beat Watertown and Aberdeen Central, schools that are a lot bigger than T.
Yeah, and I think that's really a tough pill to swallow when you're Pierre. I mean, obviously everything can change in the playoffs. They'll get a crack at them in the playoffs potentially. But when you have such a bad week 1 matchup and then you win the rest of your games of the season, I mean, maybe you should be number 1. But especially considering how they did play Harrisburg, they played them pretty okay.
Well, that's the interesting thing is the way the schedule worked out this year with 11AA, just because there's an odd number of teams in AAA. Most of the 11AA teams played a AAA team, but T actually plays an 11A team, West Central, on their schedule when they go outside of their class, where Pierre had to play Harrisburg. So quite a difference in that one game on how your record's going to work out this year. A tough draw for Pierre.
Yeah, and ultimately, like I said, the playoffs will correct everything. But it's probably nice to finish a season with the number 1 seed, and for Pierre, that's probably tough for them to look at. Just knowing that week 1 matchup against probably the toughest team in the state might prevent them from getting that number 1.
It's going to be a lot of, as we've said all year, 11AA has been a lot of fun. Let's move to 11A, where this week we've got some interesting games. A top 5 battle between Lennox and Del Rapids. Del Rapids lost week 1, and since then they've played pretty well. This will be their best test since that opening week. We've also got Sioux Falls Christian at West Central. Sioux Falls Christian still undefeated on the year. They look really good. West Central's lost not 1 but 2 nail biters. I mean, I'm talking within. I think they were both 1-point losses. They lost to Lennox earlier this year, and then they lost to Millbank last week. So West Central is going to be hungry. And then Vermilion, coming off of a good loss to Madison, their first loss of the season, they've got to go to Canton this week, who's still number 1 in the polls. 11A, any thoughts on any teams that we should be watching out for, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Sioux Falls Christian. They for me are really, really close to the top of my poll. They've been really, really good offensively this year. Tate Snyder, their quarterback, has come in. He was the backup coming into the year, and now he's the starter. And Brooks Nelson is continuing to recover, so potentially that change can be made soon. But they, even behind a line that is a little bit banged up. They've had a couple people go down in the past couple of weeks, including Mitchell Nelson, who, is probably their leader on the line, their starting center. He had a little issue at the beginning of the year, and they're expecting him back soon. But that's obviously a big loss for them. But they've been pretty much flawless since the start of the year, and I don't think a lot of people, just coming off of a year that they had last year where they weren't too strong.
Right.
I don't think many people expected that, and but they got playmakers, and they got playmakers to do it on offense, and they got playmakers to do it on defense. So they've been really impressive, and I can't wait to see them get a crack at some of the top teams in the class.
Looking forward to that one. Let's move to 11B, where Winter had one of their toughest battles of the year. They had to go to St. Thomas More. Didn't have much problem, and that's been the theme of 11B so far this year, is Winter hasn't had much problem. Bridgewater Emory Ethan moves up to number 2 in the polls. They flip with Sioux Valley. We talked about that last week, and we both still had Sioux Valley at number 2, but it's interesting to see that flip in the polls.
Yeah, and we were talking about it a little bit before the show. I mean, after a while, this would correct itself. Like, if both of these teams continue to win, that head-to-head matchup will start to mean a lot more. So as long as none of them run into Winter again.
And Sioux Valley doesn't have to play Winter, at least until maybe later in this season.
So I really think that over time, people will just maybe realize that maybe Winter's not gonna be close with really anybody. So that win over Bridgewater Emory Ethan, it's going to mean a lot less over the course of the season, and Bridgewater Emory Ethan's win over Sioux Valley is going to mean a lot more. So, I didn't quite get there this week, but I understand from the polls perspective over the course of time that this will correct itself, and these teams will flip as long as they continue to win.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that McCook Central Montrose Sioux Valley game is going to be the best of the week in 11B. McCook Central Montrose still unbeaten with a pretty convincing win at Elk Point Jefferson, a team that looked pretty good coming into this last week. I tell you what, if MCM puts up a good game against Sioux Valley, we got to start talking about them as a potential contender in this class. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about 11B a little later in the show, so stay with us when we get to the question and answers part of this program. The 9-man classes, last week we had Platte Geddes with their first loss. They didn't lose the entire season in 2020, hadn't lost so far in 2021, and they lost to Parkston with 6 turnovers in the game, 5 interceptions. Parkston, a team that had already lost a couple times this year, with the win, and to me that threw everything on its head in 9AA. do we really know what we think we know about these teams when a number one team like that loses? So credit to Parkston. They played well. Cole Prunty ran the ball well for them. They scored when they got into the red zone against Platte Geddes, a team that's tough to score on in the red zone. And they made use of those turnovers in the field position game. I think Platte Geddes will be all right coming down the stretch. This is maybe a good wake-up call for them. And I still think that they're definitely a threat in 9AA, but Parkston making their name known. Another game I have to talk about is Howard taking on Chester last week. This was one of the closer games of the week. It was really a stalemate in the first half. Chester just could not get anything going, but they showed that they can physically hang with a physical team like Howard, and I think that says a lot for Chester going forward. They're a team in 9AA I would watch out for. And Howard, on the other hand, they convinced me to have them as the number one team in 9A this week, even though DeSmet doesn't have any reason to not be the number one team. But what Howard's done against tough competition with Chester and Canastota Freeman, they've played the tougher schedule in my mind. So I went with Howard number one. I'm assuming you went with DeSmet?
Yes, yeah. DeSmet, ever since I saw them week one, I mean, they've been immovable at the top for me. I mean, I just think that they're
they're very athletic, and they haven't tripped up yet. I mean, they're still beating teams by 50.
Yeah, it hasn't been really close. So there hasn't been a reason for me to move. I mean, if they maybe played a team close and Howard does, I guess, continue to win, that's probably when I'd start to be like, But so far, Kalen Gary is the best player that I've seen in 9-man football so far. So
and Colt Wilkinson, a great two-way player. We featured him on our top performers this week, and he's he can spread the ball around to anybody. So even if Kalen Gary is seeing double coverages, he's going to find a guy open. So that's been impressive. A couple of the notes on 9-man I want to pass along. Harriet-Selby area, they've forced 15 turnovers in their first 4 games. They call their defense the Nasty Nine, and they definitely are earning that reputation because every game they've had at least 3 takeaways. In 3 of their 4 games, they've had 4. And their starting safety, Brendan Begeman, has had multiple interception games. I lost count. I was going to count him up, but I think he's got 6 interceptions so far this year, some crazy number like that. So Harriet-Selby area continuing to make some noise in 9A as they moved up from 9B. They get Kadoka area, a team receiving votes this week, and then they get Ipswich, another tough game coming up next week. So watch out for the Wolverines. I think 9A is shaping up to be the most interesting class in 9-man football. And then quickly in 9B, Potter County, they're a team that has, they beat Warner, a team above them in a class. They had a loss right away early in the season, but now they get a quality win against Hitchcock-Tulare. We're kind of looking for teams in 9B to step up, and so far for me, this Potter County team might be a team to keep an eye on, although Gayville Volland stayed at number one for the first time all year. We've had number one stay there. It's been a rotating class, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, finally the number one wins. It's almost been a bad omen for to be the number one team in 9B. I mean, it's a place that you don't want to be. But Gayville Volland, they did their job this week. Yep. They stayed at number one, and so that's a positive thing for 9B, that it's maybe not as hectic as it was in previous weeks, but that spot is very much up for grabs still. 9B is still one of the more open classes in South Dakota.
I couldn't agree with you more. I looked at the schedules a little closer this week, and Gayville Volland has pretty much had the easiest schedule of those top teams in 9B so far as their winning percentage, or the teams that they've beat winning percentage. So I think it's still wide open. I think Harding County is a team we kind of forgot about that could step back up to that top spot. I think this Potter County team we have to keep an eye on. So Faulkton is still hanging in there at number 2. They could be a team to watch as well.
I think the interesting thing there is, there's some classes in South Dakota where we see, 4-0, 3-1 teams that aren't even just receiving votes in the polls.
Right.
So,
threats, yeah.
In 9B, that's pretty much the only class where, just staying undefeated gets you to the top. Yeah. So Gayville Volland, even with an easier schedule, which is sort of the thing that are keeping some of those 4-0, 3-1 teams out of polls, in higher classes in South Dakota, that doesn't work for them. Like, as long as they win, they're up there.
That's right. That's right. This week coming up in 9-man football, we've got Garrettson against Canastota Freeman. And Canastota Freeman with a couple of tough luck losses so far. Garrettson's been riding high. They played Hanson as well as anybody and have won the rest of the games on their schedule. You had a chance to talk to Garrettson a little bit with their kicker.
Yeah, after the Jenna Van Holland scored it was a game-winning extra point in overtime. We talked a little bit about how she became kicker, and that was really interesting. But ever since then, I mean, Garrettson has proven to be a very legitimate football team. They're really good, and they're a team to follow over the course of the rest of the season.
I think they've had among the toughest schedules in 9AA, and I think that's a team by playoff time we could be talking about, especially now that Platte Geddes is knocked down a notch. Chester got knocked down a notch. I think Garrettson, Hanson, some of those teams could really rise to the top. A couple other interesting games this week. Lyman and Wall, some West River football. Wall still undefeated, still in the rankings. Lyman, probably their toughest test the rest of the way, so that'll be an interesting one. Hitchcock-Tulare takes on Faulkton Area. I think Faulkton Area could really solidify that number 2 spot in the poll and become a championship contender if they have a good performance against Hitchcock-Tulare. And then Harriet Selby Area, we talked about taking on Kadoka. They've got a 2-game stretch here where they're going to have to play at their best, where the last couple of weeks they haven't had to be at their best to win. So I think the Wolverines have a shot to really make a statement this week. Let's move on to our question and answer. So every week on the Midco Sports Instagram story, you can go on there and submit questions. And this week we got several questions to pick from, but the one that we chose to announce on the show here is from Ashton Kestelut. Hopefully I said that right. Ashton asks, what is the 11B championship game going to look like this year? And the last 3 years, it's been Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton, and Winter. What do you think the 11B championship game is going to look like this year?
Man, that's really tough because Winter, you would have to expect that Winter is going to be there.
Barring some crazy set of circumstances, Winter definitely looks like the team to beat.
Yeah, so, Sioux Valley, Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton, based on where they're at this point, you'd expect them to be probably their top contenders. But, we did mention, undefeated teams, I guess, kind of coasting a little bit just because, maybe they're playing easier schedule. But I don't think we could necessarily rule out Aberdeen Roncalli at this point. They've been playing really, really well. Obviously, they're flawless on the season so far. So, until they get a challenge, it's hard to rule them out from being there with Winter. I don't know if any team in this class can beat Winter, but it's going to be pretty close in that playoff. I mean, Elk Point Jefferson, they picked up a loss this week, but they're a really good team. So is McCook Central Montrose, who beat them this week. So, there's a lot of teams in this class that, really can make some noise. But at the end, I think it's going to be Winter and then the other team in.
I think we agree that Winter is got one of those spots. I mean, as close to locked up as you can be. But this McCook Central Montrose team is really interesting to me. They had a tough game against Beersford back in week 1, and Beersford is a team that's kind of lurking in that second tier that maybe could make a little bit of a run here. They got a nice win against Elk Point Jefferson. McCook Central Montrose did, and now they play Sioux Valley. If they can somehow stay undefeated, they have Sioux Valley this week, Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton next week. If McCook Central Montrose somehow gets through that gauntlet, they're going to go in as the number 2 seed, and then they're going to have home games all the way up until the semifinals. So I think that's key for them. Do I think that they will actually do it? I think it's going to be too tough to beat Sioux Valley and Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton back to back. I think we could be looking at another repeat with Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton, and Winter again, although I really like the progression that the Sioux Valley team has taken. The very first week, we thought Parker Pitts was going to throw the ball maybe 30, 40 times a game. He didn't. They kind of struggled against Bridgewater, Emory-Eaton, but since then, his numbers have been getting stronger and stronger as a passer, and I think that bodes well because not many teams can guard the amount of athletes that Sioux Valley have on the outside. And I think these Cossacks could be the team to make it to the Dome and play against Winter. That's my vote, at least at this week in the season. I'll probably come back in a couple weeks and change that, but it's been fun watching 11B. We talked about how fun 11AA is, how much fun 11 AAA is. I mean, all these classes have been an unraveling story. It's been fun to follow, hasn't it, Michael?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun to see how that unveils itself in the next half of the season. Michael, what have you been working on at the Argus, and what can we look forward to on coverage this weekend?
Well, this weekend, the Argus is going to be at 2 games. I'll be at 1. I'll be at Brandon Valley O'Gorman. That's homecoming for O'Gorman, so that'll be fun to get back there. Last time I was there was the Dakota Bowl, which, I was there a couple days for the Dakota Bowl, so that was fun. I feel like I've been there for 3 games already.
Yeah, exactly.
And then elsewhere in the state, we got Washington Harrisburg, which is going to be a really, really good matchup. Our own Alfonso Galvin is going to be there. So yeah, definitely look out for the coverage there. That's going to be a big, fun weekend after, probably our biggest weekend of the year. Yeah,
it was a lot of fun kind of following your guys' coverage and getting some sideline views of what you guys are seeing, so that's always fun. We are not having a live game this week in South Dakota. We have a North Dakota live game, but that will free me up. I'm going to go to homecoming at Jim River for Menno Scotland in Menno as they play Winter this week. They play at 2:30 in the afternoon, which frees me up. I've got time at 2:30 in the afternoon to go watch a game, so I'm going to go check that one out, and then I'm going to come back to Howard Wood Field and watch Stevens and Lincoln. They play at 5. And then I'm going to try to get a little bit of that Sioux Falls Christian West Central game in as well, if possible. Will depend on how those games unfold, if I can make it out there or not. But we've got Varsity Sports Live with highlights and reaction from all over South Dakota at 10:30 on Midco Sports. And it's just been a lot of fun to cover this season as it's gone on. Well, for Michael McCleary, I'm Jason Andera. We've done it. Another week of Football Insiders in the book. Make sure you continue to ask some questions so we can include your comments at the end of the show every week. We'll see you next week.